Broken Iron Covenant. Lillian Carter had spent years on the run, but when a storm forced her into Ethan Rollins' cabin, she realized she might have run straight into more trouble. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough as the wind outside. "You got nowhere else to go, do you?" he murmured. "Reckon you'll be staying here, then." Chapter 1. The Storm's Embrace. The wind howled a mournful ballad, a chorus of fury that ripped across the plains, tearing at the edges of Lillian Carter's threadbare cloak. Rain, fat and stinging, lashed down, turning the already treacherous track into a river of mud. She hunched lower in the saddle, her aging mare, Bess, struggling with each step. It had been 3 days since she'd left Redemption, 3 days of relentless riding, fueled by fear and the faint, flickering hope that she could outrun her past. But the storm, this monstrous, all-consuming tempest, was proving a more formidable adversary than any posse. Lightning cracked, illuminating the landscape in a stark, momentary tableau. Endless, rolling hills, swallowed by the gray, churning sky. The world seemed to be ending, and for a moment, Lillian wished it would. At least then, the running would be over. The constant ache in her chest, the gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for years, would finally be silenced. Bess stumbled, nearly throwing Lillian from the saddle. The mare whinnied, a sound of pure exhaustion, and Lillian felt a pang of guilt. She was asking too much of the old horse, but there was nowhere to stop, no shelter in sight. Just the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory. Then, through the driving rain, she saw it. A flicker of light, small and wavering, but undeniably there. Hope, that fragile, persistent ember, flared anew. She urged Bess forward, her numb fingers tightening on the reins. The light led her to a small, ramshackle cabin, nestled against the side of a rocky outcrop. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a promise of warmth and, perhaps, safety. It was a gamble, walking into a stranger's dwelling in the middle of nowhere, but the alternative was to face the storm alone. And Lillian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she wouldn't survive the night. She dismounted, her legs stiff and protesting, and tethered Bess to a weathered post near the cabin's entrance. The wind almost ripped the reins from her grasp. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and knocked on the rough-hewn door. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. She was about to knock again, convinced that she had imagined the light, when the door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, filling the space. He was a shadow against the dim glow of the firelight within, his features obscured. But even in the darkness, Lillian sensed a presence, a raw, untamed energy that made her instinctively wary. He didn't speak, just watched her, his eyes like chips of ice in the gloom. Lillian, who had faced down outlaws and bounty hunters, felt a tremor of unease. This man was different. He radiated a quiet danger, a sense of controlled power that was more intimidating than any raised voice or drawn weapon. I saw your light," she stammered, her voice raspy from the cold and the fear. "My horse, she's about done in. I need shelter. Just for the night." He continued to study her, his gaze unwavering. Lillian felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit caught in a snare. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill, both from the storm and from the man's scrutiny. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the cabin. "This ain't no inn, ma'am." "I know," Lillian replied, her voice stronger now, fueled by desperation. "I can pay. I have a little money." He gave a short, harsh laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Money ain't worth much out here in a storm like this." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "What's your name?" "Lillian," she said, omitting her last name. She'd learned long ago that some truths were best kept hidden. He seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze still fixed on her. Then, with a shrug that seemed to dismiss her as insignificant, he stepped back. "Get inside. Before you catch your death." Lillian hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, to take her chances with the storm. But the thought of Bess, shivering and exhausted, and the promise of warmth, however precarious, drew her forward. She stepped across the threshold, into the dimly lit cabin, and into the unknown. The interior was small and sparsely furnished. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire blazing merrily within, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A narrow cot was tucked into a corner, covered with a thick, patchwork quilt. The air was warm and dry, a welcome contrast to the raging storm outside, scented with wood smoke and something else, something indefinable, something masculine. The man closed the door, shutting out the wind and the rain, and turned to face her. The firelight illuminated his features now, revealing a face that was both rugged and strangely compelling. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 50s, with lines etched deep into his tan skin, testament to a life lived under the harsh western sun. His hair was thick and gray, streaked with silver, and his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held a depth of experience, a hint of sadness, that made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. He had a scar that ran down the length of his left cheek. He was not handsome, not in the conventional sense, but there was a strength, a resilience, in his features that drew her in. He gestured towards the fire.
Get warm.
You're soaked through. Lillian nodded, grateful for the simple courtesy. She moved towards the fireplace, holding out her hands to the flames, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move, and the unease returned, a knot tightening in her stomach. I appreciate this, she said, turning to face him. I don't want to be any trouble. He gave a non-committal grunt. Trouble's my middle name, ma'am. Or it used to be, anyway. He moved towards a small wooden cupboard, pulling out a tin cup and a bottle of whiskey.
Drink this.
It'll warm you from the inside. She took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. She took a sip of the whiskey, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat, chasing away the lingering chill. Thank you, she said, her voice a little steadier now. He nodded, pouring himself a drink. He didn't offer her any food, and Lillian didn't ask. She was a guest here, an uninvited one, and she would take what was offered and be grateful for it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the muffled roar of the storm outside. Lillian stole glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma that he presented. He was a man of few words, that much was clear, but there was something else, something hidden beneath the surface, that both intrigued and frightened her. He finished his whiskey and set the cup down on the table with a decisive thud. You can sleep on the cot, he said, his voice still gruff. I'll take the floor. Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off with a raised hand.
No arguments.
I'm used to it. She closed her mouth, realizing that arguing would be futile. He was a man who was accustomed to getting his way, a man who lived by his own rules. And she, for tonight at least, was at his mercy. A shiver went down her spine that had little to do with the lingering cold. Something told her that stepping into this cabin had been more than just seeking shelter from the storm. It felt like stepping into a different kind of tempest altogether, one just as dangerous, and perhaps far more captivating. She looked at the cot, then back to the man, his figure stark against the flickering firelight. A silent question hung heavy in the air, a question about the night ahead and all the nights that might follow, in this lonely, isolated place, with this enigmatic, dangerous man. Her past was still out there, somewhere, but a new, unforeseen future was beginning to take shape, right here, in the heart of the storm. Chapter 2.
Rolling stare.
The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the woolen blanket Lillian had wrapped around herself. Ethan Rollins hadn't moved from his position by the table, his presence a solid, unyielding force in the small cabin. He simply watched her, his blue eyes, intense and unwavering, seeming to penetrate the layers of clothing and pretense, right down to the core of her being. It was a stare that spoke of long years spent observing, judging, surviving. A stare that made Lillian acutely aware of her own vulnerability, of the secrets she carried like stones in her pockets. She tried to meet his gaze, to project an air of confidence, of defiance, but it was difficult. His eyes held a knowing, a world weariness that made her feel like a child caught in a lie. She had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her, that he knew she was running, even if he didn't know from what. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, momentarily distracting her from the intensity of his gaze. She shifted her weight, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the ruffle scratching against her skin. The whiskey had warmed her, but it hadn't calmed the tremor of unease that ran through her. "You said your name was Lillian," Rollins finally said, his voice breaking the silence. It was a statement, not a question, and it held a subtle challenge. "Yes," she replied, holding her breath, waiting for him to ask the inevitable follow-up. Her last name, the name that would reveal her past, the life she had desperately tried to leave behind.
But he didn't ask.
He simply continued to stare, his eyes boring into hers. Lillian felt a bead of sweat trickle down her temple, despite the relative coolness of the cabin. She resisted the urge to wipe it away, fearing that any movement would betray her nervousness. He took a step closer and Lillian instinctively recoiled. He stopped, his expression unreadable. "You're afraid," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, as if he were commenting on the weather. Lillian swallowed hard. "The storm, it was bad," she said, trying to deflect the truth. He gave a slow nod, acknowledging her words, but his eyes told a different story. He knew she was lying, or at least, not telling the whole truth. "Storms pass," he said, "but some things they linger." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. He was talking about more than just the weather. He was talking about the past, about the shadows that clung to her, the ghosts that haunted her dreams. He moved again, this time circling her slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. Lillian felt trapped, pinned beneath his gaze. She wished she could disappear, melt into the shadows, become invisible. "You're running from something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was a statement of fact, not a question. Lillian's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't deny it, not with those piercing blue eyes fixed on her. But she couldn't confess, either. The truth was too dangerous, too damaging. "We all have things we're running from," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was a weak defense, but it was all she had. He stopped his circling, standing directly in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the scent of wood smoke and whiskey on his breath, a strangely comforting aroma in the midst of her fear. He reached out a hand and Lillian flinched, expecting him to grab her, to accuse her, to expose her. But his touch was surprisingly gentle. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his calloused fingers lingering on her skin for a fleeting moment. "Some things are worth running from," he said, his voice softening slightly. "And some things are worth facing." His words, and the unexpected tenderness of his touch, caught Lillian off guard. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, of judgment. But she saw only a deep, weary sadness, a reflection of her own pain. For a moment, the fear receded, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar feeling. A sense of connection, of understanding. It was as if, in that brief moment of contact, he had seen something in her, something beyond the lies and the fear, something that she herself had almost forgotten. He dropped his hand, the connection broken, and the fear returned, sharper and more intense than before. He had seen too much, she realized. He was too perceptive, too dangerous. "I should check on my horse," she said, her voice shaking. She needed to escape, to put some distance between them, to regain her composure. He nodded, stepping back to allow her to pass.
"She's in the lean-to, out back."
I gave her some oats. Lillian hurried to the back door, grateful for the excuse to leave his presence. She slipped outside, into the darkness, the rain having slowed to a drizzle. The wind still howled, but it was less fierce now, less threatening. She found Bess in the lean-to, sheltered from the elements. The mare nuzzled her affectionately, her warm breath a comfort in the cold night. Lillian leaned against her, burying her face in her mane, trying to calm her racing heart. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the distant rumble of thunder. She thought about Rollins, about his piercing stare, his unsettling words, his unexpected touch. He was a mystery, an enigma, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And yet, despite her fear, despite the danger he represented, she felt drawn to him. There was something about him, something that resonated deep within her, something that whispered of a shared pain, a shared struggle, a shared need for redemption. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. She wasn't sure if she was running from him, or towards something she couldn't quite define, something that shimmered on the edge of her awareness, like a mirage in the desert. The night held its breath, and so did Lillian, suspended between the fear of her past and the uncertain promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Fugitive Past. The scent of coffee, strong and bitter, drifted through the cabin, pulling Lillian from a restless sleep. She lay on the cot for a moment, disoriented, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her like cobwebs. She had dreamt of running, of being chased by shadowy figures, their faces obscured, their voices a menacing whisper. It was a recurring dream, a constant reminder of the life she had left behind. She sat up, pushing the thick quilt aside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, flickering glow across the room. Rollins was nowhere to be seen. The cabin felt empty, silent, except for the gentle crackle of the dying fire and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She rose, her muscles stiff and aching from the previous day's ride. She walked to the small, grimy window, peering out at the dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The sky was a pale, pearly gray, streaked with the first tentative rays of sunlight. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. It was a beautiful morning, a morning that should have filled her with peace and hope. But Lillian felt only a gnawing anxiety, a sense of impending doom. She knew that she couldn't stay here, that she had to keep moving. But the thought of leaving, of facing the vast, unforgiving landscape alone, filled her with a familiar dread. She heard the sound of the door opening, and she turned to see Rollins entering the cabin, his arms laden with firewood. He didn't look at her, just walked straight to the fireplace, depositing the wood with a thud. He began to rebuild the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Lillian watched him, her mind racing. She had to make a decision. She could leave now, while he was preoccupied, and take her chances on the open road. Or she could stay for a little while longer and risk the danger that he represented. "There's coffee," he said, his voice breaking the silence. He still hadn't looked at her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice hesitant. She walked to the table, where a tin pot sat simmering on a small, three-legged stool near the hearth. She poured herself a cup, the strong aroma filling her senses. He finished building the fire, the flames leaping up, casting a warm glow across the room. He turned to face her then, his blue eyes searching hers. "You slept poorly," he said, his voice a statement, not a question. Lillian nodded, unable to deny it. "Old dreams," she said, her voice a whisper. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Dreams can tell us things," he said, "if we're willing to listen." Lillian took a sip of her coffee, the bitter liquid burning her tongue. She didn't want to listen to her dreams. They were too painful, too revealing. "I don't believe in dreams," she said, her voice flat. He gave a slow nod, as if he understood.
"Maybe not," he said.
"But they believe in us." He walked to the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He sat down opposite her, his presence filling the small space. Lillian felt a tremor of unease, but also a strange sense of comfort. They drank their coffee in silence, The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind outside. Lillian tried to avoid his gaze, but she could feel him watching her, his eyes probing, questioning. "Where were you headed?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence again. Lillian hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. "West," she said, choosing a vague direction. To find work." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his expression. "What kind of work?" Lillian shrugged. "Anything," she said. I'm good with horses. I can cook. I can clean." She listed the skills that had served her well in her previous life, the skills that had allowed her to survive. He nodded, as if he expected nothing more. "There's a ranch about a day's ride from here," he said. "The Bar X. They might be hiring." Lillian's heart skipped a beat.
A ranch.
It was a risky proposition. Ranches were often places of close-knit communities, where strangers were viewed with suspicion. But it was also a chance, a possibility of finding a temporary haven, a place to rest and regroup. Do you know the owner?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Rollins nodded. "Old man Henderson. He's a hard man but fair. He's lost a lot lately. Family.
Gone.
He could use the help." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "He's also a man who minds his own business. He won't ask questions you don't want to answer." Lillian felt a surge of hope. It was a slim chance, but it was something. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. He shrugged, dismissing her thanks. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "He might not hire you. And even if he does, it won't be easy." Lillian knew that. Nothing in her life had ever been easy. But she was used to hardship, used to fighting for survival. She could handle it. She had to. "I'll take my chances," she said, her voice firm. He studied her for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and pity. "You're a strong woman, Lillian," he said. "Stronger than you know." His words surprised her. No one had ever called her strong before. They had called her foolish, reckless, dangerous, but never strong. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his. For a fleeting moment, she saw something in his gaze, something that mirrored her own pain, her own resilience. A flicker of understanding, of connection. It was a dangerous feeling, this connection. It made her want to trust him, to confide in him, to tell him the truth about her past. But she knew she couldn't. The past was a burden she had to carry alone. It was a secret that could destroy her, and anyone who got too close. The echo of gunshots in a dusty street, the screams, the blood, it all came rushing back. She pushed it down, buried it deep, as she always did. She had to, for both their sakes. Chapter 4. The Price of Sanctuary. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. Lillian and Rollins ate a simple breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, the silence between them punctuated only by the clinking of tin cups and the crackling of the fire. The unspoken questions, the weight of their secrets, hung heavy in the air. Lillian finished her meal and stood up, brushing crumbs from her worn trousers. "I should be going," she said, her voice betraying a hint of reluctance. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin, of facing the unknown again, filled her with a familiar anxiety. Rollins nodded, his eyes following her as she moved towards the door. "The Bar X is due west," he said. "Follow the creek for about half a day, then head towards the Twin Peaks. You can't miss it." "Thank you," Lillian said, her voice sincere. She owed him more than she could ever repay. He had given her shelter, food, and a chance, however slim, at a new beginning. He stood up, his tall frame filling the doorway. He looked down at her, his blue eyes intense and searching. "There's a price for everything, Lillian," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this, had known that there would be a cost. Nothing in life was free, especially not kindness from a stranger. What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to stare at her, his gaze unwavering. Lillian felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She had faced down dangerous men before, but there was something about Rollins, something in his quiet intensity that unnerved her. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to stay." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to ask for money, for favors, for something tangible. But this was unexpected, and far more unsettling.
"Stay?"
she repeated, her voice incredulous.
"But why?"
He shrugged, his broad shoulders rising and falling. "I'm alone here," he said. "I could use the company. And the help." Lillian searched his face, trying to decipher his true motives. Was it loneliness? Or something else, something darker, something more dangerous? She couldn't tell. He was a master of concealing his emotions, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of stoicism. I don't know, she said, her voice hesitant. The offer was tempting, in a way. The thought of having a safe place to stay, of not having to run, of having someone to share the burden of her existence, was almost overwhelming. But it was also a trap, a cage, a potential prison. "Think about it," he said, his voice softening slightly. "There's no rush. You can stay here tonight, decide in the morning." Lillian nodded, unable to refuse. She needed time to think, to weigh her options. She couldn't make a decision based on fear, or on a fleeting sense of gratitude. She had to be rational, to consider the risks and the rewards. She spent the rest of the day helping Rollins with chores around the cabin. She gathered firewood, fetched water from the creek, and mended a tear in his worn leather jacket. The work was familiar, comforting, a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her mind. Rollins worked alongside her, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a constant, reassuring force. She found herself watching him, studying his face, his hands, his body. He was a man of the land, a man who had lived a hard life, a man who carried his own secrets. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Lillian found herself drawn to the quiet strength he exuded. She had been alone for so long, fighting her battles, carrying her burdens. The thought of sharing that load, even for a little while, was incredibly appealing. But the fear remained, a constant undercurrent, a whisper of warning. She couldn't forget who she was, what she had done. She couldn't forget the danger that followed her, the shadow that clung to her like a second skin. They ate dinner in silence, the fire casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of attraction and apprehension. Lillian knew that she had to make a decision, and she knew that whatever she chose, it would change her life forever. After dinner, Rollins went outside to check on Bess. Lillian stood by the window, watching him, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw him stroke the mare's neck, talking to her in a low, soothing voice. He was a good man, she realized, despite his rough exterior, despite the secrets he kept. He returned to the cabin, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a question. Lillian took a deep breath, her decision made. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "But on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I won't share your bed," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. It was a bold statement, a challenge, but she had to draw a line. She wouldn't be his mistress, his plaything. She would be his helper, his companion, nothing more. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow nod. "Agreed," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. She had found sanctuary for now, but she knew that the price might be higher than she could ever imagine. The night wrapped around the cabin, silent and watchful, as Lillian faced the unsettling truth she was no longer running, but she was far from safe. She was bound to this man, to this place, by a fragile agreement, and the echoes of her past still whispered a warning she couldn't ignore. Chapter 5. Beneath a Watchful Moon. The first week at Rollins' cabin settled into a rhythm, a quiet routine punctuated by the sounds of the wilderness and the unspoken tension between Lillian and Ethan. They worked together, clearing brush, mending fences, tending to the small garden that Ethan had managed to cultivate against the odds. The work was hard, physical, but it was also a balm to Lillian's soul. It kept her mind occupied, her hands busy, and for a few precious hours each day, she could almost forget the past that haunted her. Ethan remained an enigma. He was a man of few words, his emotions carefully guarded, his thoughts hidden behind those piercing blue eyes. He treated Lillian with a respectful distance, honoring their agreement, never crossing the line she had drawn. But she often caught him watching her, his gaze intense and searching, as if he were trying to unravel the mysteries she held within. The nights were the hardest. Lillian slept on the cot, wrapped in the thick quilt, while Ethan slept on the floor near the fireplace, his presence a constant, reassuring weight in the small cabin. She would lie awake for hours, listening to his steady breathing, the crackling of the dying fire, the howls of coyotes in the distance. She would think about her past, about the choices she had made, the mistakes she had committed. And she would wonder about Ethan, about his past, his secrets, his reasons for wanting her to stay. One night, a full moon bathed the landscape in a silvery glow, its light streaming through the small cabin window. Lillian couldn't sleep. The moonlight seemed to amplify her restlessness, her anxieties. She rose from the cot, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders, and walked to the window. The view was breathtaking. The rolling hills, the distant mountains, the vast expanse of the sky, all bathed in the ethereal light of the moon. It was a scene of such beauty, such peace, that it brought tears to her eyes. She heard a movement behind her, and she turned to see Ethan sitting up, watching her. He had shed his shirt, and the moonlight illuminated his broad chest, his muscled arms, the silver streaks in his gray hair. He looked like a creature of the wild, a part of the landscape, both rugged and beautiful. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Lillian shook her head, unable to speak. She felt exposed, vulnerable, under the watchful gaze of the moon and of this man. He rose from the floor, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards her, stopping just a few feet away. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the intensity of his presence. "It's a beautiful night," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Lillian nodded, her gaze drawn back to the window, to the moonlit landscape. "It is," she said, her voice barely audible. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the gentle night breeze and their own breathing. Lillian felt a strange connection to him, a sense of shared wonder, of shared loneliness. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. She didn't know why she asked the question. It just slipped out, a spontaneous expression of her own longing. He knew what she meant. He didn't need her to explain. "Miss what?" he asked, although the answer was already reflected on his face. "The life you had," she clarified. "Before this." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Sometimes," he said, his voice filled with a deep, weary sadness. "But the past is the past. There's no going back." His words resonated with Lillian. She knew the truth of them, the painful reality. But still, she couldn't help but wonder, couldn't help but dream of a different life, a life free from the shadows that haunted her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the moonlit landscape, his gaze lost in the distance. "Regret is a heavy burden," he said finally. "It can crush you if you let it." Lillian knew that all too well. She had carried the burden of regret for years, and it had almost destroyed her. "But sometimes," he continued, his voice turning thoughtful, "regret can lead you to a different path. A better path." His words gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was a chance for redemption, for a new beginning, even for someone like her. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. "What about you, Lillian?" he asked. "Do you regret the life you left behind?" It was the first time he had asked her directly about her past. Lillian hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to trust him, to tell him the truth, but the fear was too strong. I made mistakes," she said, her voice evasive. "Mistakes I can't undo." He nodded, as if he understood. "We all make mistakes, Lillian," he said. "It's what we do after that matters." His words were a comfort, a balm to her wounded soul. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. He was offering her a chance to forgive herself, to move on. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice sincere. He smiled, a rare, fleeting smile that transformed his rugged features. "You don't need to thank me, Lillian," he said. "We're in this together now." His words sent a shiver down her spine. They were a promise and a threat. She was bound to him, to this place, to this life. She was no longer alone, but she was also no longer free. She was tethered to him by a shared past, a shared present, and an uncertain future. The moon continued its silent watch, casting its silvery light on the two figures standing by the window, their destinies intertwined, their secrets hidden in the shadows. The night held its breath, waiting to see if they would find solace in each other's company, or if their pasts would eventually tear them apart. Chapter 6. Scars of the Frontier. The days continued to unfold with a quiet predictability, but beneath the surface, the currents of unspoken emotions and hidden histories ran deep. Lillian and Ethan worked side by side, their movements gradually sinking into a harmonious dance of shared labor. They rarely spoke of personal matters, but their shared silence was often more revealing than words. One afternoon, while mending a section of the fence that had been damaged by a stray steer, Lillian noticed a series of scars on Ethan's back. He had removed his shirt to ward off the midday heat, and as he bent to secure a loose wire, the sunlight illuminated the raised, jagged lines that crisscrossed his skin. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. The scars were old, faded, but they spoke of a violent past, of battles fought and wounds endured. They were a stark reminder of the harsh realities of frontier life, of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of even the most peaceful landscapes. She tried to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen, but it was too late. Ethan straightened up, his eyes meeting hers. He knew she had seen the scars, and he knew what she was thinking. He didn't say anything, just continued to work, his movements deliberate and controlled. But Lillian could sense a shift in his demeanor, a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. She wanted to ask him about the scars, to understand the stories they told, but she hesitated. She knew that he was a private man, that he guarded his past fiercely. She didn't want to pry, to intrude on his personal space. But the curiosity gnawed at her. She had her own scars, both visible and invisible, and she recognized in Ethan a kindred spirit, someone who had also been marked by life's hardships. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Lillian finally found the courage to speak. "Those scars," she began, her voice hesitant. "On your back." Ethan didn't look at her, just continued to eat, his gaze fixed on the flames. "They're old," he said, his voice flat. "I know," Lillian said. "But they must have a story." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Stories best left untold," he said. Lillian persisted, driven by a need to understand, to connect. "Sometimes, telling the stories can help," she said. "It can lighten the burden." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. "Some burdens can't be lightened, Lillian," he said. "Some scars run too deep." Lillian knew that was true, but she also believed in the power of sharing, of empathy. She had carried her own burdens in silence for too long, and it had almost destroyed her. "Maybe not," she said. "But maybe sharing them can make them easier to bear." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering the risks of opening up, of revealing his vulnerability. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "It was a long time ago," he said. "A different life. I was a different man." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the fire. "I rode with a group of men. We weren't saints. We did what we had to do to survive." Lillian listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what he was talking about. Outlaws. She had encountered them before, in her previous life. She had even been involved with one. "We robbed banks," trains, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. We lived by our own rules. We took what we wanted. He paused again, his face etched with regret.
It was a brutal life, he said.
A life of violence, of loss. I did things that I'm not proud of. The scars, Lillian realized, were a testament to that life. They were the physical manifestations of his past, of the choices he had made, the consequences he had endured. And then, she prompted, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting sadness. And then it all fell apart, he said. There was a betrayal. A shootout. I lost everything. He didn't elaborate, but Lillian could imagine the scene. The chaos, the gunfire, the blood. She had seen it before, in her own nightmares. It was a foolish mistake to trust so easily, he said, his gaze distant. He stood up, his movements stiff and awkward. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. I came here, he said, to escape. To start over. To try to forget. Lillian understood. She had done the same. She had run away from her past, hoping to find a new life, a new identity. But the past, she knew, was never truly gone. It lingered, like a shadow, always waiting to return. But you can't forget, can you? She asked, her voice soft. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness.
No, he said.
You can't. He looked at her, a question in his eyes, a question about her own past, her own scars. The night air was thick with unspoken truths, with the shared pain of two souls who had sought refuge in the wilderness, only to find that their pasts had followed them, etched onto their bodies and buried deep within their hearts. The unspoken question hung between them: could they ever truly escape, or would they forever be defined by the scars of the frontier? Chapter 7. The Sheriff's Shadow. A week after Ethan shared the fragmented story of his past, a rider appeared on the horizon. Lillian saw him first, a distant figure against the vast, rolling plains, slowly approaching the cabin. Her heart quickened its pace. Strangers were rare in this isolated part of the territory, and their arrival was rarely a cause for celebration. She alerted Ethan, who was chopping wood near the barn. He straightened up, his axe resting on the chopping block, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the approaching figure. He, too, seemed to sense the potential for trouble. As the rider drew closer, Lillian recognized the distinctive uniform of a lawman. A silver star glinted on his chest, catching the sunlight. It was Sheriff Brody, from the town of Dust Creek, a settlement about 2 days' ride to the east. Lillian felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had no reason to fear the law, not anymore. She had left that life behind. But old habits died hard, and the sight of a sheriff always triggered a primal instinct to flee. Ethan, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He waited, his stance relaxed but watchful, as the sheriff approached. Sheriff Brody was a middle-aged man, with a weathered face and a stern demeanor. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, a man who upheld the law with an unwavering hand. He dismounted his horse, his movements stiff and deliberate, and approached Ethan and Lillian. "Rollins," he said, his voice gruff, his eyes fixed on Ethan. It was a greeting, but it lacked warmth. "Sheriff," Ethan replied, his voice equally devoid of emotion. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Lillian, his eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "And this is?" "Lillian," Ethan said, his voice giving nothing away. "She's helping me out around here." The sheriff nodded, his eyes lingering on Lillian for a moment longer than necessary. "I see," he said. He turned his attention back to Ethan. "I need to talk to you, Rollins. Alone." Lillian felt a surge of anxiety. She didn't like the way the sheriff was looking at Ethan, the subtle undercurrent of hostility in his voice. She had a bad feeling about this. Ethan, however, remained unfazed. "We can talk here," he said, his voice calm and steady. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking to Lillian again. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering whether to insist on privacy. "It's about the robbery and redemption," he said finally, his voice low and serious. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. Redemption. The town she had fled, the town where her past had caught up with her. The town where she had killed a man. She felt a wave of dizziness, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She forced herself to remain calm, to control her fear. She couldn't let the sheriff see her panic. Ethan, however, didn't react. He remained still, his expression unchanged. "What about it?" he asked, his voice betraying no emotion. "We got a witness," the sheriff said.
Someone who saw the whole thing.
"Someone who identified you." Lillian's blood ran cold. A witness. She had been so careful, so sure that no one had seen her. But she had been wrong. Her past had found her, even in this remote corner of the world. Ethan didn't deny it. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply stared at the sheriff, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and resignation. He knew something, that much was clear, but the lack of an immediate and outright denial was unsettling to say the least. "I need you to come with me, Rollins," the sheriff said, his voice firm. "For questioning." Ethan nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "All right, sheriff," he said. "I'll come." Lillian was stunned. She had expected him to fight, to resist, to run. But he was surrendering willingly to the law. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He gave her a small, sad smile. "It's all right, Lillian," he said. "It's time." Time for what? Lillian wanted to ask. Time to face his past? Time to pay for his crimes? Or time for something else, something she couldn't comprehend? The sheriff handcuffed Ethan, his movements rough and impersonal. Lillian watched, her heart breaking, as they led him away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She was alone again. The sanctuary she had found, the fragile peace she had built, had been shattered. The sheriff's shadow had fallen across her life, bringing with it the darkness of the past, the threat of exposure, the possibility of losing everything she had fought so hard to gain. The cabin felt empty, cold, without Ethan's presence. The weight of her own secrets pressed down on her, heavier than ever. She didn't know what to do, where to go. She was trapped, caught between the past and the present, between the law and the outlaw, between fear and a desperate, flickering hope that somehow Ethan would return. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving her in a darkness filled with uncertainty, her own past a looming specter, just as threatening as the sheriff who had ridden away with the only person who had offered her a semblance of safety. Chapter 8. A shared silence. The days following Ethan's arrest stretched into an eternity of anxious waiting. Lillian stayed at the cabin, tending to the chores, keeping the place running as if he would return at any moment. But with each passing sunset, the hope of his swift return dwindled, replaced by a gnawing fear that she would never see him again. She found herself constantly replaying the sheriff's words, the accusation, the witness. She tried to make sense of it, to understand how Ethan, who had seemed so determined to leave his past behind, could be connected to the robbery and redemption. It didn't fit. It contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out at the vast, empty landscape, her mind filled with questions, with doubts, with a growing sense of despair. She missed Ethan, his quiet presence, his strength, his unexpected kindness. She missed their shared silence, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. One evening, as she was preparing a meager meal, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it be Ethan? Or was it the sheriff, returning with more bad news? She cautiously opened the door, her hand resting on the handle of the old hunting knife she kept tucked into her belt. It wasn't Sheriff Brody. It was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with fiery red hair and a determined expression. She was riding a sturdy, well-groomed horse, and she carried herself with an air of confidence that belied her age. "Hello?" Lillian said, her voice hesitant. "I'm looking for Ethan Rollins," the young woman said, her voice clear and strong. "Is he here?" Lillian hesitated, unsure how to answer. She didn't know this woman, didn't know her intentions. "He's not here at the moment," she said, choosing her words carefully. The young woman frowned, her eyes searching Lillian's face. Do you know where he is? It's important. Lillian took a deep breath. She had to make a decision, to trust her instincts. Something about this woman, her direct gaze, her earnest demeanor, told her that she wasn't a threat. He was arrested, Lillian said, her voice low and somber, by Sheriff Brody, for the robbery and redemption. The young woman's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in disbelief.
That's impossible, she said. Ethan wouldn't do something like that.
Not anymore. Lillian felt a surge of relief. This woman believed in Ethan's innocence, just as she did. I know, Lillian said. But there's a witness, someone who claims to have seen him. The young woman shook her head, her red hair flying.
It's a lie, she said.
Ethan was with me that day. We were miles away from redemption. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. An alibi. Ethan had an alibi. This woman could prove his innocence. Who are you? Lillian asked, her voice filled with hope. My name is Sarah, the young woman said. Sarah McCrae. And Ethan, he's my father. Lillian was stunned. Ethan had a daughter. He had never mentioned her, had never spoken of his family. Another secret, another layer to the mystery that was Ethan Rollins. Sarah dismounted her horse, her movements graceful and agile. She approached Lillian, her eyes filled with concern. We need to help him, she said. We need to clear his name. Lillian nodded, her mind racing. She and Sarah, two women from different worlds, bound together by their connection to Ethan, by their belief in his innocence. They would work together, share their knowledge, their resources, to fight for his freedom. Sarah stayed at the cabin, and the two women spent the evening talking, sharing their stories, piecing together the puzzle of Ethan's past. Sarah revealed that Ethan had left her and her mother years ago, seeking a new life, a life free from violence and crime. He had kept in touch, sending money and letters, but he had never returned. Lillian, in turn, shared her own story, carefully omitting the details of her crime, but revealing enough to establish a bond of trust with Sarah. They discovered a shared resilience, a shared determination to survive, to overcome adversity. As the night wore on, a comfortable shared silence began to form between the women, echoing the connection Lillian shared with Ethan. Sarah bore a striking resemblance to him, sharing the intense stare, though her eyes were a brighter shade of green. The quiet in the cabin wasn't oppressive, like the initial days after Ethan had been taken, but thoughtful and somber. They made a plan. Sarah would ride to redemption, confront the witness, and gather evidence to prove Ethan's alibi. Lillian would stay at the cabin, keeping things running, and waiting for their return. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. They were two women, alone in a harsh and unforgiving world, fighting against the odds, driven by their love and loyalty for a man who had touched both their lives in profound ways. The fire died down. The silence deepened. The shared hope began to solidify. Tomorrow, a new, dangerous journey will start. Chapter 9. The Whispers of Redemption. Sarah set off at dawn, a determined figure on horseback, disappearing into the vast expanse of the plains. Lillian watched her go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She trusted Sarah, trusted her fierce loyalty to her father, but she also knew the dangers that awaited her in redemption. Lillian spent the day tending to the chores, her mind constantly replaying her own memories of redemption. The dusty streets, the rowdy saloons, the faces of the people she had known, the life she had left behind. It was a world of violence and betrayal, of secrets and lies. She had escaped it once, but now, it seemed, she was being drawn back into its orbit. She found herself thinking about the man she had killed, the man whose death had forced her to flee. She had never intended to kill him. It had been an act of self-defense, but the law and his powerful family had seen it differently. She had been branded an outlaw, a fugitive, and she had been running ever since. She wondered if the witness who had identified Ethan was somehow connected to her own past. Was it a coincidence, or was there a deeper, more sinister connection? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. As the days passed, Lillian's anxiety grew. She had no word from Sarah, no way of knowing what was happening in Redemption. She started to imagine the worst, picturing Sarah captured, imprisoned, or worse. One evening, as she was sitting by the fire, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it be Sarah? Or was it the sheriff, returning with more bad news? She cautiously opened the door, her hand resting on the handle of the hunting knife. It was Sarah, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes filled with a fierce determination. She was not alone. Beside her rode a man, tall and lean, with a weathered face and a quiet intensity that reminded Lillian of Ethan. "Lillian," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. "This is Jake. He's the witness." Lillian was stunned. The witness. The man who had accused Ethan. What was he doing here? Jake dismounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and remorse. I made a mistake," he said, his voice hesitant. "It wasn't Ethan I saw in Redemption. It was someone else." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. A mistake. It had all been a mistake. Ethan was innocent.
But why?
Lillian asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you accuse him?" Jake looked down, his face etched with shame. "I was pressured," he said, "by Sheriff Brody. He told me what to say. He showed me a picture of Ethan, said he was a dangerous outlaw. I believed him." Lillian's blood ran cold. Sheriff Brody. He had framed Ethan.
But why?
What was his motive? "Brody, he's corrupt," Sarah said, her voice filled with anger. "He's been taking bribes from the Stanton gang. They're the ones who robbed the bank in Redemption. Ethan, he was investigating them. He was getting too close." The Stanton gang. Lillian had heard of them. They were a ruthless band of outlaws, known for their brutality and their control over several towns in the territory. It all made sense now. Ethan had stumbled upon their operation, and Brody, their paid protector, had tried to silence him. He had used Jake, an innocent man, as a pawn in his game. "We need to expose Brody," Sarah said. "We need to clear Ethan's name." Lillian nodded, her mind racing. It was a dangerous undertaking. Brody was a powerful man, with allies in high places. But they had no choice. They had to fight for Ethan, for justice. "Jake," Lillian began, "are you willing to testify? Tell the truth of what you saw, and what Brody made you do." Jake met her gaze. The remorse was still in his eyes, but was slowly being replaced by a spark of resolve. "Yes, I've done wrong, and I'll not stand by any further and let a good man take the fall." "Then let's go." "Dawn's almost upon us," Sarah stated, a sense of urgency in her voice. The three of them, an unlikely alliance, set off for Dust Creek, where Ethan was being held. They rode through the night, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They were riding towards a confrontation, a showdown with a corrupt lawman and a powerful outlaw gang. They were risking their lives, but they were doing it for Ethan, for justice, for the hope of a better future. The whispers of redemption had led them on a twisted path, but now, those whispers were guiding them towards a confrontation that could either liberate them or bury them all. The first hints of light were creeping over the horizon, a pale promise of a new day, a day that would hold their fate in its hands. Chapter 10. Broken Trust and Bitter Truths. The ride to Dust Creek was tense and silent. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the weight of their mission and the dangers that lay ahead. Lillian's mind raced, trying to anticipate Brody's moves, to devise a plan to expose his corruption and free Ethan. As they approached the town, Lillian noticed a change in Jake. He seemed increasingly nervous, his eyes darting around, his hands trembling on the reins. She wondered if he was having second thoughts, if the fear of Brody's retribution was getting to him. They reached the outskirts of Dust Creek just as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town was quiet, still asleep, but Lillian knew that it wouldn't be long before the sheriff's office came alive. They dismounted their horses, tethering them to a hitching post near the jailhouse. The building was small and unassuming, made of rough-hewn logs, but it represented the power of the law, a power that had been twisted and corrupted by Sheriff Brody. "We need to be careful," Lillian said, her voice low and cautious. "Brody won't give up easily. He has too much to lose." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll be ready for him," she said. "We have the truth on our side." Jake, however, seemed less confident. He hung back, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know," he stammered. Maybe this isn't such a good idea." Lillian's heart sank. She had feared this, had sensed his growing apprehension. She knew that if Jake lost his nerve, their plan would fall apart. "Jake," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You need to be strong. Ethan's life depends on you. You're the only one who can clear his name." Jake looked up at her, his eyes filled with conflict. He was torn between his fear of Brody and his desire to do the right thing. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice trembling. "Brody, he's a dangerous man. He won't hesitate to hurt me." Lillian placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch reassuring. "We'll protect you, Jake," she said. "We won't let anything happen to you." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "Brody is the one who should be scared," she said. "He's the one who's going to pay for what he's done." Her words seemed to bolster Jake's courage. He took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. "All right," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'll do it. I'll tell the truth." Lillian felt a surge of relief. They had overcome their first hurdle. Now they had to face Brody. They approached the jailhouse, their steps slow and deliberate. Lillian could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She knew that they were walking into a trap, that Brody would be waiting for them. As they reached the door, it swung open, and Sheriff Brody stepped out, his face a mask of anger and defiance. He was flanked by 2 deputies, their hands resting on their holstered guns. Well, Brody said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what the cat dragged in. The runaway fugitive, the grieving daughter, and the lying witness." Lillian met his gaze, her eyes filled with contempt. "We know the truth, Brody," she said. "We know about your deal with the Stanton gang. We know you framed Ethan." Brody laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You have no proof," he said. "It's your word against mine. And who's going to believe a bunch of outlaws and liars?" "I will," Jake said, stepping forward. His voice was shaky, but firm. "I'll tell everyone what you did. I'll tell them how you forced me to lie." Brody's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Jake. "You're making a big mistake, boy," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A mistake you'll regret." Before anyone could react, Brody drew his gun, his movements swift and deadly. He aimed it at Jake, his finger tightening on the trigger. "No!" Lillian screamed. Everything happened in a blur. Sarah lunged at Brody, trying to knock the gun from his hand. One of the deputies grabbed her, throwing her to the ground. Lillian drew her hunting knife, her only weapon, and charged at Brody. A shot rang out. Lillian felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. She looked up, her vision blurred, and saw Jake lying on the ground, his chest covered in blood. Brody stood over him, his gun still smoking, his face a mask of cold fury. "That's what happens to liars," he said. Lillian's heart sank. Jake was dead. Their witness, their hope, was gone. And she, wounded and unarmed, was at Brody's mercy. She was trapped in a room, surrounded by enemies, her plan shattered, her trust broken. The bitter truth of the frontier had caught up with her sometimes. Even the best intentions couldn't overcome the brutal reality of corruption and violence. The echoes of gunshots, past and present, merged into a deafening roar in her ears, and she knew that this confrontation, this betrayal, might be her last. Chapter 11. The Outlaw's Code. Lillian stared at Jake's lifeless body, a wave of grief and rage washing over her. Brody had killed him in cold blood, silencing the only witness who could have cleared Ethan's name. She felt a surge of despair, a sense of utter hopelessness. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't give up. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let Brody win. She had to find a way, somehow, to expose his corruption, to avenge Jake's death, to free Ethan. She looked up at Brody, her eyes filled with hatred. He was smiling a cruel, triumphant smile that made her blood boil. "You think you've won, Brody," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "But you haven't. You'll pay for this. I swear you will." Brody laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're in no position to make threats, fugitive," he said. "You're wounded, unarmed, and surrounded by my men. You're finished." He gestured to his deputies, who stepped forward, their guns drawn. They grabbed Lillian, their grip rough and painful, and dragged her to her feet. Her wounded shoulder throbbed, sending waves of agony through her body. "Take her to the jail," Brody ordered, "and lock her up. She'll hang at dawn, alongside Rollins." Lillian struggled against the deputy's grip, but it was useless. She was weak, outnumbered, and defeated. She was led into the jailhouse, her heart heavy with despair. The jail cell was small and dark, with a single, barred window that offered a sliver of light. The air was stale and musty, carrying the scent of sweat and fear. Lillian sank onto the rough wooden cot, her body aching, her mind racing. She was trapped. There was no way out. Brody had won. He would kill her and Ethan, and he would continue his reign of corruption, protected by his badge and his guns. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the reality of her situation, trying to find some solace, some escape. She thought of Ethan, of his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, his belief in her. She couldn't let him down. She had to find a way, somehow, to save him. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cell, and she opened her eyes. It was Sarah, her face bruised and swollen, her clothes torn. The deputies had roughed her up, but her spirit remained unbroken. "Lillian," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Lillian nodded, managing a weak smile. "I've been better," she said. Sarah reached through the bars, taking Lillian's hand. Her touch was warm and reassuring. "We're not giving up," she said. "We'll find a way out of this." Lillian squeezed her hand, grateful for her friendship, her loyalty. But she couldn't see a way out. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outgunned. Suddenly, they heard a commotion outside the jailhouse, a series of shouts and gunshots. Lillian and Sarah exchanged a look of surprise and confusion. What was happening? The door to the jailhouse burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Ethan, his face grim, his eyes blazing with anger. He was holding a rifle, and he was flanked by a group of men, their faces hardened, their weapons drawn. Lillian's heart leaped with joy and relief. Ethan was free. He had come for her. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice filled with emotion. He rushed to her cell, his eyes searching hers. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Just a scratch," she said, dismissing her wounded shoulder. "But Jake Brody killed him." Ethan's eyes darkened with fury. "I know," he said. "I saw it all." He turned to his men, his voice firm and commanding. "Take Brody," he said. "And his deputies. Dead or alive. I don't care." The men surged forward, their movements swift and decisive. They engaged Brody's deputies in a fierce gunfight, the sound of gunfire echoing through the jailhouse. Ethan unlocked Lillian's cell, his touch gentle and reassuring. He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her. How did you escape?" Lillian asked, her voice still trembling. "My friends," Ethan said, gesturing to his men. "They're old acquaintances. From my past." Lillian understood. Ethan's former outlaw gang. They had come to his rescue, repaying a debt, honoring an old code. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very life Ethan had tried to leave behind had now saved him. The gunfight ended quickly. Brody's deputies were either dead or captured. Brody himself was found hiding in his office, his face pale with fear. Ethan confronted him, his rifle pointed at Brody's chest. "It's over, Brody," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Your reign of terror is finished." Brody tried to plead, to bargain, but Ethan was unmoved. He had seen too much, suffered too much to let Brody escape justice. "You killed an innocent man, Brody," Ethan said. "You framed me. You corrupted this town. You deserve to hang." Ethan cocked the rifle. Lillian knew this was his old code, his former life, presenting him with a choice. Brody began to weep, begging for his life. But then, Ethan lowered the rifle. "But I'm not you," he continued. "I left that life behind. Others can decide your fate." He handed his rifle to Sarah and stepped away. With Brody captured and his deputies disarmed, Ethan's men secured the town. They would send word to the territorial governor, requesting a fair trial and an investigation into Brody's corruption. The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over Dust Creek. The town was free, its people liberated from Brody's tyranny. Lillian and Ethan stood together, their hands clasped, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and hope. They had survived. They had fought for justice, and they had won. But the battle had come at a cost. Jake was dead, and Lillian and Ethan were both scarred, physically and emotionally. They had been reminded of the brutal realities of the frontier, of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of even the most seemingly peaceful towns. But they had also been reminded of the power of friendship, of loyalty, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. They had found redemption, not in running from their pasts, but in confronting them, in fighting for what was right, in embracing a new code, a code of justice, of compassion, of hope. The dawn broke, not with a hanging, but with the promise of a new beginning, a new chapter in their lives, a chapter that would be written together, in the heart of the wild, untamed frontier. Chapter 12. A Dance with Danger. The news of Brody's capture and the liberation of Dust Creek spread like wildfire across the territory. People from neighboring towns and settlements flocked to Dust Creek, eager to witness the downfall of the corrupt sheriff and to celebrate their newfound freedom. The territorial governor sent a detachment of soldiers to maintain order and to oversee the investigation into Brody's crimes. A temporary sheriff was appointed, a man of integrity and courage, who promised to restore justice and fairness to the town. Ethan and Lillian were hailed as heroes, their bravery and determination praised by everyone. But they remained humble, shunning the spotlight, preferring to stay out of the public eye. They knew that their fight was far from over. Brody's allies, the Stanton gang, were still at large, and they would undoubtedly seek revenge. Ethan's former outlaw companions, who had helped him escape and capture Brody, decided to stay in Dust Creek for a while, offering their assistance to the new sheriff. They were a rough bunch, their faces scarred, their hands calloused, but they had proven their loyalty to Ethan, and they had earned the respect of the townspeople. Lillian, still recovering from her shoulder wound, spent her days helping Sarah tend to the wounded and comforting the families of those who had been killed or injured during Brody's reign of terror. She found solace in helping others, in using her skills and her compassion to make a difference. One evening, as the town was preparing for a celebration, a dance to mark their liberation, Ethan found Lillian sitting alone on the porch of the jailhouse, her gaze lost in the distance. He sat down beside her, his presence a comforting weight. "You're quiet," he said, his voice gentle. Lillian nodded, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how much things have changed." Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the bustling town square, where people were setting up tables, stringing lanterns, and preparing for the festivities. "For the better, I hope," he said. Lillian sighed, a deep, weary sound.
"I don't know," she said.
"Sometimes I feel like we're just dancing with danger. One wrong step and we could fall." Ethan understood her fear. He had felt it himself, many times. The frontier was a dangerous place, a place of uncertainty, of constant threat. But it was also a place of opportunity, of hope, of the possibility of a new beginning. "We're not alone, Lillian," he said, his voice firm. "We have each other. And we have friends. We'll face whatever comes, together." Lillian turned to him, her eyes meeting his. She saw in his gaze a strength, a resilience, that mirrored her own. She also saw a tenderness, a vulnerability, that touched her heart. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice sincere. For everything. He smiled, a rare, fleeting smile that transformed his rugged features. You don't need to thank me, Lillian, he said. You saved my life, too. He reached out a hand, and Lillian took it, her fingers intertwining with his. Their touch was warm and reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of their bond, their shared journey. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the preparations for the dance. The music started, a lively tune played by a fiddler and a banjo player, and people began to gather in the town square, their faces lit by the warm glow of the lanterns. Will you dance with me, Lillian? Ethan asked, his voice hesitant. Lillian was surprised. She hadn't expected him to ask. He didn't seem like the dancing type. But she saw in his eyes a longing, a desire to celebrate, to embrace the joy of the moment. I don't know how, she said, her voice self-conscious. She had never been to dance before, had never learned the steps. Ethan chuckled, a low, rumbling sound.
It's easy, he said.
Just follow my lead. He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. He led her to the town square, his arm around her waist, his hand holding hers. The music swirled around them, the rhythm infectious, the atmosphere festive. Lillian felt a surge of excitement, of nervousness, but also of happiness. She was dancing with Ethan, the man who had saved her life, the man who had become her friend, her confidant, her something more. He guided her through the steps, his movements graceful and confident. Lillian stumbled at first, her feet clumsy, her body stiff. But she gradually relaxed, following his lead, letting the music carry her. They danced, their bodies swaying, their eyes locked. Lillian felt a connection to Ethan, a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. She forgot her fears, her worries, her past. She was just Lillian, dancing with Ethan, in the heart of a town that had been reborn, under the watchful gaze of the stars. But the dance, like life on the frontier, was not without its dangers. As they twirled and swayed, Lillian noticed a group of men standing at the edge of the crowd, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Ethan. She recognized them instantly. The Stanton gang. They had come for revenge. The music faded into a distant hum as her heart pounded a warning. This dance was far from over, and the next steps could be their last. Chapter 13. The Heart's Reckoning. Lillian's hand tightened on Ethan's as she spotted the Stanton gang. Her breath hitched, the festive atmosphere instantly turning ominous. She knew they were there for Ethan, for revenge, and the joyful dance had suddenly become a prelude to a potentially deadly confrontation. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. They're here. The Stanton gang. Ethan's eyes followed hers, his expression hardening. He didn't seem surprised. He had probably expected them, had known that their victory over Brody wouldn't go unpunished. Stay close to me, he said, his voice low and firm. He guided her towards the edge of the dance floor, away from the crowd, his movements deliberate and cautious. The music continued, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows. People laughed and danced, their faces flushed with excitement, unaware of the impending violence. The Stanton gang, 5 men strong, their faces hardened, their hands resting on their holstered guns, began to move towards Ethan and Lillian. Their leader, a tall, scarred man with cold, cruel eyes, stepped forward. Well, Rollins, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Looks like you've been having a little party. Sorry to interrupt. Ethan stood his ground, his body tense, his eyes narrowed. You're not welcome here, Stanton, he said, his voice cold and hard. Stanton laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. We're not here for your welcome, Rollins, he said. We're here for revenge. For Brody. And for you. Lillian felt a surge of fear, but she stood firm beside Ethan, her hand still gripping his. She wouldn't abandon him, wouldn't let him face this alone. Brody was a corrupt lawman, Ethan said. He deserved what he got. Stanton's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Ethan.
He was our partner, he said.
He protected us. And you took him away from us. You're going to pay for that. He drew his gun, his movements swift and deadly. The other members of the gang followed suit, their guns pointed at Ethan and Lillian. The music stopped abruptly. The dancers froze, their faces turning pale with fear. The town square, once filled with joy and laughter, was now silent, tense, a stage for a deadly showdown. "This doesn't have to end in violence, Stanton," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "Put your guns down. Leave this town, and we'll let you go." Stanton laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You think we're afraid of you, Rollins?" he said. "You're outnumbered. You're outgunned. You're finished." Lillian knew that Ethan was right. They were surrounded, trapped, with no way out. But she also knew that Ethan wouldn't surrender, wouldn't back down. He would fight to the end, even if it meant his death. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Not so fast, Stanton." It was Sarah, her red hair blazing, her eyes filled with fury. She was holding a rifle, and she was flanked by Ethan's former outlaw companions, their weapons drawn. "You're the ones who are outnumbered," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "This town is under our protection, and we won't let you harm Ethan, or anyone else." The townspeople, emboldened by Sarah's courage, began to arm themselves, grabbing whatever weapons they could find: rifles, pistols, knives, even pitchforks. They formed a circle around the Stanton gang, their faces determined, their eyes filled with defiance. Stanton looked around, his expression shifting from arrogance to surprise, then to anger. He realized that he had underestimated the townspeople, their unity, their courage. "This ain't your fight," Stanton said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "It is now," a voice boomed. It was the temporary sheriff, stepping forward with his deputies, all heavily armed. "You're under arrest, Stanton, for the murder of Jake Miller and for the attempted murder of Ethan Rollins and Lillian Carter." Stanton hesitated, his eyes darting around, assessing his options. He was trapped, surrounded, with no way out. He knew that if he tried to fight, he would be killed. He lowered his gun, his movements slow and deliberate. "All right," he said, his voice grudging. "We surrender." The other members of the gang followed suit, their guns dropping to the ground. The tension in the town square eased, replaced by a collective sigh of relief. The deputies moved in, disarming the Stanton gang and handcuffing them. The townspeople cheered, their voices filled with joy and triumph. They had faced down a dangerous threat, and they had won. Ethan and Lillian stood together, their hands still clasped, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. They had survived again. But the encounter had left its mark. As the Stantons were led away and the crowd began to disperse, Ethan turned to Lillian. His calloused hand gently cupped her cheek. The emotions she had suppressed all day came rushing through. "Thank you," he said quietly, a world of subtext in those words. Lillian met his gaze. Words seemed insufficient. She leaned in, her lips finding his. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of burgeoning affection, and of a shared understanding that transcended words. It was a promise, a reckoning of the heart. The danger they faced had forced them to confront their feelings, to acknowledge the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened by loyalty, and sealed with a kiss under the watchful eyes of the stars and a recovering, grateful town. Chapter 14. Flight Across the Plains. The aftermath of the confrontation with the Stanton gang left Dust Creek in a state of cautious optimism. The gang's capture had removed a significant threat, but the knowledge that other outlaws and remnants of Brody's corrupt network might still be lurking kept everyone on edge. Ethan and Lillian, despite their public roles in the events, tried to retreat from the limelight. They returned to Rollins' cabin, seeking the solace and quietude of their secluded life. However, the peace they craved was elusive. The events in Dust Creek had stirred up too much, awakened too many ghosts. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan spoke with a somber tone. "Lillian, we can't stay here." Lillian looked at him, surprised but not entirely unexpected. She had sensed a growing restlessness in him, a feeling that mirrored her own.
"Why?"
she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "It's not safe," Ethan said. "Brody's gone. The Stantons are captured, but there are others. Others who might seek revenge. Others who know about my past, and now yours too." Lillian nodded, understanding his concerns. Their actions in Dust Creek had made them targets. They had become symbols of resistance, and that made them vulnerable. "Where would we go?"
she asked.
Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and uncertainty.
"West," he said.
"Further west. To a place where no one knows us. Where we can start over. Truly start over." The idea was both daunting and appealing. To leave everything behind, to disappear into the vastness of the frontier, to shed their pasts like old skins. It was a risk, a gamble, but it was also a chance, a possibility of a new life, a life free from fear and pursuit. "It's dangerous," Lillian said, voicing her concerns. "We'll be alone, with no one to rely on but ourselves. We'll have each other," Ethan said, his voice firm. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Lillian looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had grown to trust Ethan, to rely on him, to love him. She knew that she could face anything, as long as she was with him. "All right," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's go." They began to prepare for their journey, gathering supplies, packing their belongings, making arrangements for the cabin and the livestock. They told Sarah of their plans, and she, though saddened by their departure, understood their reasons. She promised to keep an eye on things in Dust Creek and to help in any way she could. A few days later, under the cover of darkness, they set off, riding west, towards the setting sun. They left behind the cabin, the town, the life they had known, and ventured into the unknown. The journey was arduous, the landscape unforgiving. They traveled through vast plains, across rugged mountains, and along treacherous rivers. They faced storms, heat, and hunger. They encountered wild animals, hostile Native American tribes, and the constant threat of outlaws. But they persevered, their determination fueled by their desire for a new life, their love for each other. They relied on their skills, their instincts, their shared strength. They learned to trust each other implicitly, to support each other, to protect each other. They traveled for weeks, their journey marked by hardship and danger, but also by moments of beauty and wonder. They witnessed breathtaking sunsets, vast starry skies, and the raw, untamed beauty of the frontier. They shared stories, dreams, and fears. They grew closer, their bond strengthening with each passing day. One evening, as they were camped by a small stream, Lillian looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for bringing me with you, for giving me a chance at a new life." Ethan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You don't need to thank me, Lillian," he said. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." He leaned in, kissing her softly, his touch tender and loving. Lillian responded, her heart overflowing with emotion. They had found each other in the midst of chaos and violence, and they had forged a love that was stronger than any adversity. They knew that their journey was far from over, that they still faced many challenges, many uncertainties. But they were no longer running from their pasts. They were moving towards a future they would build together, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. The vast plains stretched before them, an empty canvas upon which they would paint their new lives, their shared destiny. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of finally being free. They were pioneers, not of land, but of the heart, forging a new path, a new code, in the wild, untamed landscape of their love. Chapter 15. The Weight of a Promise. Their journey west continued, each day a testament to their resilience and their growing bond. The landscape shifted from rolling plains to rugged mountains, the challenges evolving with the terrain. They hunted for food, foraged for water, and slept under the stars, their bodies weary, but their spirits undaunted. One particularly difficult stretch involved crossing a vast, arid desert. The sun beat down mercilessly, the water scarce, and the threat of heat stroke and dehydration ever present. Lillian, despite her toughness, began to weaken. Her lips cracked, her skin burned, and her energy flagged. Ethan, noticing her struggles, shared his limited water supply, rationing his own intake to ensure she had enough. He walked beside her horse during the hottest parts of the day, offering shade with his body, his concern etched on his weathered face. "We'll make it, Lillian," he said, his voice hoarse but reassuring. "Just a little further. We'll find water. We'll find shelter." Lillian, her throat parched, her vision blurred, managed a weak smile. She trusted Ethan, trusted him with her life. She knew that he would do everything in his power to protect her, to keep her safe. One evening, as they were setting up camp, Lillian collapsed. She had pushed herself too hard, ignoring the warning signs of her body. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms holding her close. "Lillian," he cried, his voice filled with alarm. "What's wrong?" Lillian couldn't answer. Her head was spinning, her vision darkening. She felt a wave of nausea, and then everything went black. Ethan gently laid her on the ground, his heart pounding with fear. He checked her pulse, relieved to find it weak but steady. He knew that she was suffering from heat stroke, and he had to act quickly. He used the last of their water to wet a cloth, placing it on her forehead, trying to cool her down. He spoke to her, his voice soothing, reassuring, even though she couldn't hear him. "You're going to be all right, Lillian," he whispered. "I promise you. I won't let anything happen to you." He remembered a promise he had made, long ago, to another woman, a promise he had failed to keep. His wife, Sarah's mother, had died of a fever years ago when he was away, chasing his outlaw dreams. He had never forgiven himself for that, for not being there to protect her. He wouldn't fail Lillian. He wouldn't break another promise. He would do whatever it took to save her. He stayed by her side all night, watching over her, praying for her recovery. He felt helpless, vulnerable, facing the harsh reality of the frontier, where life and death were separated by a thin, fragile line. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Lillian's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Ethan, her vision blurry, her head pounding. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here, Lillian," he said, his voice filled with relief. "You're all right. You're safe." Lillian tried to sit up, but Ethan gently restrained her. "Rest," he said. "You need to regain your strength." Lillian closed her eyes, exhausted but grateful. She was alive, thanks to Ethan. He had saved her, again. They remained camped in that spot for several days, allowing Lillian to recover. Ethan hunted for food and found a small spring, ensuring they had enough water. He tended to her, caring for her with a tenderness that touched her deeply. As Lillian regained her strength, she realized the depth of Ethan's love for her, the sacrifices he was willing to make. She also realized the weight of the promises he carried, the ghosts of his past that still haunted him. She knew that their journey was not just about finding a new life, but also about healing old wounds, about forgiving themselves and each other, about finding redemption. It was a journey of the heart, a journey of the soul, a journey that would test their love and their resilience to the very core. The desert, vast and unforgiving, had brought them to the brink, but it had also shown them the strength of their bond, the depth of their commitment. They had faced death, and in doing so, had found a renewed appreciation for life, for love, for the promise of a future together, a future they would build, one step at a time, in the heart of the wild, untamed West. Chapter 16. Hidden in the canyon's depths. After Lillian's recovery, they continued their westward trek, leaving the harsh desert behind and entering a region of towering canyons and winding rivers. The landscape was breathtaking, a tapestry of red rock formations, lush green valleys, and cascading waterfalls. It was a place of hidden beauty, of secluded sanctuaries, a place where they might finally find the peace and anonymity they sought. They discovered a narrow canyon, its entrance concealed by a thick curtain of willow trees and tangled vines. It was a natural fortress, easily defensible, with a freshwater spring and abundant wildlife. It seemed like the perfect place to settle, to build a new life, to escape the shadows of their pasts. "This is it, Lillian," Ethan said, his voice filled with a sense of hope and finality. "This is where we'll stay." Lillian looked around, her eyes taking in the beauty and the isolation of the canyon. It was a place of refuge, a place of healing, a place where they could finally be free. "It's perfect, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. They began to build a cabin using the materials provided by the canyon logs, stones, and mud. They worked together, their movements synchronized, their efforts fueled by their shared dream of a new beginning. They built not just a shelter, but a home, a place where they could live in peace, surrounded by the beauty of nature, protected by the towering canyon walls. As the cabin neared completion, they started to explore the surrounding area, discovering hidden caves, ancient petroglyphs, and the remnants of a long-abandoned Native American settlement. They felt a connection to the land, a sense of belonging, a feeling that they had finally found their place in the world. One day, while exploring a narrow side canyon, they stumbled upon a small, hidden valley, a lush oasis filled with wildflowers, fruit trees, and a crystal-clear stream. It was a paradise, a secret garden, a place where they could escape the harsh realities of the outside world. "It's like something out of a dream," Lillian said, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the valley, his expression filled with awe. "It's a gift, Lillian," he said. "A gift from the land." They decided to keep the valley a secret, a place of their own, a sanctuary where they could retreat and reconnect with nature, with each other. As the days turned into weeks, they settled into a routine, a rhythm of life dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the moon. They hunted, fished, gathered wild fruits and vegetables, and tended to their small garden. They lived simply off the land, their needs minimal, their contentment profound. They also spent time talking, sharing their stories, their dreams, their fears. They delved deeper into their pasts, revealing secrets they had kept hidden for years, confronting the demons that had haunted them. They found healing in each other's company, in each other's love, in the quiet solitude of a canyon. One evening, as they were sitting by the stream in their secret valley, Lillian turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with a question. "Ethan," she said, her voice hesitant, "do you ever regret leaving everything behind? Your daughter, your old life?" Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I miss Sarah. I worry about her. But I know she's strong.
She'll be all right."
He paused, his gaze drifting towards the setting sun. "As for my old life, I don't regret leaving it behind. It was a life of violence, of regret. This is a better life. A life of peace, of love, of redemption." Lillian nodded, understanding his feelings. She, too, had left behind a life filled with pain and regret. She had found solace in this new life, in Ethan's love, in the beauty of the canyon. "We've found something special here, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Something worth protecting." Ethan reached out, taking her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We will protect it, Lillian," he said. "Together. We'll build a life here, a life free from fear, a life filled with love, a life that is truly our own." The canyon walls echoed his promise, the setting sun casting a golden glow on their faces. They were hidden, protected, in the depths of this natural sanctuary, their pasts fading like distant echoes, their future stretching before them like the vast, open sky. They had found their home, their refuge, their paradise, and they would defend it, nurture it, and cherish it, together, for as long as they lived. The weight of their past was still there, but it was balanced by the lightness of their newfound freedom, their shared hope, their enduring love. Chapter 17. Flames of the Past. Life in the canyon settled into a peaceful rhythm. Lillian and Ethan worked together, tending to their small garden, hunting and fishing, and making improvements to their cabin. They had created a sanctuary, a haven from the outside world, where they could live in harmony with nature and with each other. But even in this secluded paradise, the past had a way of intruding. One day, while Ethan was out hunting, Lillian noticed a plume of smoke rising in the distance, beyond the canyon walls. Her heart quickened its pace. Smoke meant fire, and fire in this dry, rugged landscape could mean disaster. She climbed to a high vantage point, her eyes scanning the horizon. The smoke was coming from the direction of Dust Creek, the town they had left behind. She felt a surge of anxiety. Could it be a wildfire? Or something worse? She waited anxiously for Ethan's return, her mind racing with possibilities. When he finally arrived, his face grim, her fears were confirmed. "It's Dust Creek," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "It's under attack." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "By who?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I don't know for sure," Ethan said. "But I saw riders heading in that direction. It could be remnants of Brody's network. Or someone else seeking revenge." Lillian felt a wave of guilt and responsibility. They had left Dust Creek, seeking their own peace, but they had also left their friends vulnerable. They had a responsibility to help, to defend the town they had helped liberate. "We have to go back," she said, her voice firm. Ethan hesitated, his eyes filled with conflict. He knew the dangers, the risks. He had promised Lillian a life of peace, a life free from violence. But he also knew that they couldn't turn their backs on their friends, on the people who had trusted them. "It's too dangerous, Lillian," he said. "We could be walking into a trap." "We can't just stand by and do nothing," Lillian said. "Sarah is there. Our friends are there. They need our help." Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw in her gaze a determination, a courage, that mirrored his own. He knew that she was right. They had a duty, a responsibility, to fight for what was right. "All right," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll go back. But we'll be careful. We'll do what we can, and then we'll leave. We won't stay." They packed their supplies, saddled their horses, and set off, riding towards the smoke-filled horizon. They knew that they were riding back into danger, back into the flames of their past, but they were doing it together, their love and their loyalty their only weapons. As they approached Dust Creek, they saw the devastation. Buildings were burning, people were running in panic, and the sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air. It was chaos, a scene of destruction and violence that brought back painful memories of their own past lives. They found Sarah, her face soot-stained, her clothes torn, but her spirit unbroken. She was helping to organize the defense of the town, rallying the townspeople, and fighting alongside the temporary sheriff and Ethan's former outlaw companions. "Ethan! Lillian!" she cried, her voice filled with relief and surprise. "You came back. We couldn't leave you to face this alone," Ethan said, his voice grim. They joined the fight, their skills and their experience proving invaluable. Ethan, with his outlaw past, knew how to fight dirty, how to use the terrain to his advantage. Lillian, with her quick thinking and her courage, helped to tend to the wounded, to organize the defenses, and to keep the townspeople's spirits up. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain. The attackers, a motley group of outlaws and mercenaries, were well-armed and determined. But the townspeople, fighting for their homes, for their lives, for their freedom, were equally determined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the burning town, the tide of the battle began to turn. The attackers, weakened and demoralized, began to retreat, fleeing into the surrounding hills. Dust Creek had been saved, but at a great cost. Many buildings had been destroyed, many lives had been lost, and the town was scarred, both physically and emotionally. Ethan and Lillian, exhausted and battered, stood together amidst the ruins, their hearts heavy with grief and loss. They had helped to save the town, but they had also been reminded of the brutal realities of the frontier, of the constant threat of violence, of the fragility of peace. They knew that they couldn't stay in Dust Creek. It was too dangerous, too close to their past. They had to leave, to find their own sanctuary, to build their own future. The flames of the past had touched them again, reminding them of the world they had left behind, but also reinforcing their determination to find a different path, a path of peace, of love, of lasting security. They had a promise to keep, a promise to themselves, a promise to each other, and they would not let the shadows of the past extinguish the flame of their hope. Chapter 18. A Desperate Gamble. With Dust Creek smoldering behind them, Lillian and Ethan rode hard, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the violence they had left behind. They knew that staying would only invite more trouble, more danger, and they were determined to find a place where they could finally live in peace. They rode for days, their bodies weary, their spirits drained. They avoided towns and settlements, sticking to the less traveled trails, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. One evening, as they were setting up camp, Ethan spoke with a troubled tone. "We're running out of supplies, Lillian," he said. "We need to find a place to resupply, and soon." Lillian nodded, her heart heavy with concern. She knew that they couldn't continue like this, living off the land, with limited resources. They needed to find a town, a settlement, where they could buy food, ammunition, and other necessities. But entering a town was risky. They were both known figures, their faces associated with the events in Dust Creek. They could be recognized, arrested, or worse. "There's a small trading post," Ethan said, his voice hesitant, "about a day's ride from here. It's called Haven. It's remote. Off the main trails. Maybe we could risk it." Lillian looked at him, her eyes filled with apprehension. It was a gamble, a desperate gamble, but they had no other choice. They had to take the risk. "All right," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Let's do it." They set off early the next morning, their horses refreshed after a night's rest. They rode cautiously, their senses on high alert, their hands never far from their weapons. As they approached Haven, they saw that it was indeed a small, isolated settlement, consisting of a few rough-hewn buildings clustered around a central trading post. It was a place where people came to trade furs, supplies, and information, a place where anonymity was valued and questions were rarely asked. They entered the settlement slowly, their eyes scanning the faces of the people they encountered. They saw trappers, miners, and prospectors, their faces weathered, their clothes worn, their eyes guarded. They didn't seem to recognize Ethan or Lillian, or if they did, they didn't show it. They dismounted their horses, tethering them to a hitching post near the trading post. They entered the building, their hearts pounding in their chests. The trading post was dimly lit, its shelves stocked with a variety of goods: food, clothing, tools, ammunition, and whiskey. The air was thick with a scent of tobacco, leather, and sweat. The proprietor, a stout, middle-aged man with a bushy beard and a shrewd gaze, greeted them with a nod. "What can I do for you folks?" he asked, his voice neutral. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "We need supplies," he said. "Food, ammunition, blankets, and anything else you think we might need." The proprietor looked at them, his eyes assessing their appearance, their demeanor. He seemed to be weighing their trustworthiness, their ability to pay. "You new to these parts?" he asked, his voice still neutral. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "We are," he said. "We're heading west, looking for a place to settle." The proprietor nodded, as if he understood. "West is a good place to get lost," he said. "Plenty of room out there, plenty of opportunity, and plenty of danger." He began to gather the supplies they had requested, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't ask any more questions, didn't pry into their past, didn't seem to care who they were or where they came from. Lillian felt a sense of relief. They had found a place where they could blend in, where they could remain anonymous, at least for a while. As the proprietor was totaling up their purchases, a group of men entered the trading post, their faces familiar, their eyes filled with malice. Lillian recognized them instantly. They were bounty hunters, and they were looking for her and Ethan. Well, one of them said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The famous Lillian Carter and Ethan Rollins. Seems like your luck has finally run out." Lillian's heart sank. Their gamble had failed. They had been found. Their past, it seemed, would never truly release them. The quiet trading post had suddenly become a potential battleground, their desperate gamble turning into a desperate fight for survival. The weight of their past, the price of their freedom, had caught up with them, and the hope of a peaceful future seemed to slip away with every menacing step the bounty hunters took closer. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Confrontation. The air in the trading post thickened with tension. The bounty hunters, 5 of them, spread out, blocking the exit, their hands resting on their holstered guns. Lillian and Ethan were trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run. "We've been looking for you too," the lead bounty hunter said, his voice cold and hard. "There's a hefty price on your heads. Dead or alive. Doesn't matter to us." Ethan stood his ground, his body tense, his eyes narrowed. "We're not going back," he said, his voice firm. "We've done nothing wrong." The bounty hunter laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're wanted for murder, robbery, and aiding a known outlaw," he said. "That's enough for us." Lillian felt a surge of anger. They had been framed, hunted, and persecuted for crimes they hadn't committed. They had fought for justice, for freedom, and they had paid a heavy price. "We're not going to let you take us," she said, her voice clear and strong. The bounty hunter smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. "You don't have a choice," he said. "We're taking you in one way or another." He drew his gun, his movements swift and deadly. The other bounty hunters followed suit, their guns pointed at Ethan and Lillian. The proprietor of the trading post, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and concern, stepped forward. "Hold on now," he said, his voice raised. "There's no need for violence. This is a place of business, not a battlefield." The lead bounty hunter turned to him, his eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this, old man," he said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when you threaten my customers," the proprietor said, his voice firm. "I won't have bloodshed in my store." He reached under the counter, pulling out a double-barreled shotgun, his movements surprisingly quick. He pointed it at the bounty hunters, his finger on the trigger. "Now, I suggest you put your guns down and leave," he said, his voice unwavering. "Or you'll face the consequences." The bounty hunters hesitated, surprised by the proprietor's unexpected intervention. They had expected an easy capture, a quick payday, not a standoff with an armed and determined shopkeeper. "You're making a mistake, old man," the lead bounty hunter said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "The only mistake here is yours," the proprietor said. "Now, get out." The bounty hunters exchanged glances, assessing their options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a man who was clearly willing to fight. They lowered their guns, their movements slow and deliberate. "All right," the lead bounty hunter said, his voice grudging. "We'll leave. But this isn't over. We'll be back." They turned and walked out of the trading post, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Lillian and Ethan let out a collective sigh of relief. They had been given a reprieve, a second chance. The proprietor lowered his shotgun, his body relaxing. He looked at Ethan and Lillian, his expression a mixture of sympathy and warning. "You folks are in trouble," he said. "Those bounty hunters won't give up easily. They'll be back, and they'll bring more men." Ethan nodded, his face grim. "We know," he said. "We appreciate your help. But we can't stay here. We'll only bring more danger to you and your establishment." The proprietor nodded, understanding their situation. "There's a back way out," he said. "It leads to a hidden trail that goes up into the mountains. It's rough, but it'll get you away from here." He gave them directions, his voice low and hurried. He also gave them some extra supplies, refusing any payment. "Good luck to you folks," he said. "You'll need it." Ethan and Lillian thanked him profusely, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had found an unexpected ally, a man who had risked his life to help them. They slipped out the back way, following the hidden trail, their horses climbing the steep, rocky path. They knew that they were still being hunted, that their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. But they had a head start, a chance to escape, to find a new hiding place. As they rode, the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, casting a golden glow on the rugged landscape. They were riding towards a new day, a new confrontation, a new uncertainty. But they were riding together, their love and their loyalty their only weapons against the dangers that lay ahead. The trading post, the gamble, the unexpected ally, it had all been a test, a trial, and they had survived. But the dawn brought with it not peace, but the promise of another chase, another fight, another desperate struggle for freedom. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The hidden trail led them high into the mountains, a rugged, unforgiving landscape of towering peaks, deep canyons, and dense forests. It was a place where few people ventured, a place where they could disappear, at least for a while. They rode for days, their bodies weary, their supplies dwindling. They knew that the bounty hunters were still pursuing them, their relentless pursuit fueled by the promise of a hefty reward. One evening, as they were setting up camp in a secluded valley, they heard the distant sound of horses' hooves. They knew instantly that their pursuers had found them. "We can't outrun them, Lillian," Ethan said, his voice grim. "We have to make a stand." Lillian nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was it, the final confrontation. They had run as far as they could, and now they had to fight. They chose their ground carefully, a narrow pass between two towering rock formations. It was a natural bottleneck, a place where they could defend themselves against a larger force. They prepared for battle, checking their weapons, gathering stones and branches to create makeshift barricades. They knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were determined to fight to the end, to protect each other, to defend their freedom. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the bounty hunters appeared, their faces grim, their guns drawn. They were led by the same man who had confronted them in the trading post, his eyes filled with malice and determination. "This is it, Rollins," he shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. "There's nowhere left to run. Surrender now, and we'll take you in alive." Ethan stood his ground, his rifle raised, his eyes narrowed. "We're not surrendering," he shouted back. "You'll have to take us by force." The bounty hunter laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "So be it," he said. He gave a signal, and the bounty hunters charged, their horses thundering towards the narrow pass. Ethan and Lillian opened fire, their bullets finding their marks, but the bounty hunters kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. It was a fierce and brutal battle, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, the shouts of men, and the cries of the wounded. Lillian and Ethan fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their courage unwavering. They fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose, their love for each other their only shield, their only strength. As the battle raged, Lillian saw an opportunity. She noticed a narrow ledge overlooking the pass, a place where she could flank the bounty hunters, gain a strategic advantage. "Ethan," she shouted, "cover me." She scrambled up the rocky slope, her movements swift and agile. Ethan provided covering fire, his bullets keeping the bounty hunters at bay. Lillian reached the ledge, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She took aim, her rifle steady, her eyes focused. She fired, her bullets finding their targets with deadly accuracy. The bounty hunters, caught by surprise, began to fall, their attack faltering. Ethan, seeing his chance, charged forward, his rifle blazing. The remaining bounty hunters, demoralized and outnumbered, turned and fled, disappearing into the mountains. The battle was over. Ethan and Lillian had won. They had survived the final confrontation. They stood together, exhausted and wounded, but alive. They embraced, their bodies trembling, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the mountains, they looked at each other, their eyes filled with love and understanding. They had faced death, and they had emerged victorious. They had paid a heavy price for their freedom, but they had finally earned it. They had shed their pasts, like old skins, and they had found a new life, a new love, a new beginning. They knew that their journey was not over, that they still faced many challenges, many uncertainties. But they were no longer running. They were free, free to live, to love, to build a future together, in the heart of the wild, untamed West. Their final confrontation had not been with the bounty hunters, but with their own fears, their own doubts, their own pasts. And in overcoming those, they had found not just freedom, but each other, completely and irrevocably. The horizon stretched before them, vast and open, a promise of a new dawn, a new life, a new love, forged in the crucible of adversity and sealed with the unwavering bond of their hearts. Epilogue. Years passed. The rugged mountains that had once been their refuge became their home. Ethan and Lillian built a life together, far from the prying eyes of the law and the ghosts of their past. They built a sturdy cabin, larger than the one they'd left behind, nestled in a valley even more secluded than the one they'd first found. They raised livestock, cultivated a thriving garden, and lived in harmony with the land. Time softened the edges of their memories, but it never erased them. They spoke often of Sarah, hoping she was well and happy. They remembered Jake, the reluctant witness, with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They never forgot the people of Dust Creek, the town they had helped to liberate. Their life was not without its challenges. The frontier was a harsh and unforgiving place, and they faced storms, droughts, and the occasional threat from wild animals. But they faced them together, their love and their resilience their greatest strengths. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, a lone rider appeared in the distance. Lillian's heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare, almost unheard of, in their secluded valley. As the rider drew closer, a familiar figure became clear. It was Sarah, her red hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the passage of time, but her eyes still bright with the same fierce determination. Lillian and Ethan rushed to greet her, their hearts overflowing with joy and emotion. It had been years since they had last seen her, years of silence and uncertainty. "Sarah!" Ethan cried, his voice choked with emotion. He embraced his daughter, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. Lillian joined the embrace, tears streaming down her face. It was a reunion they had dreamed of, a moment of profound happiness and relief. Sarah had brought news, both good and bad. Dust Creek had prospered, its people living in peace and freedom. The temporary sheriff had been elected permanently, and he had kept his promise to uphold the law fairly. The Stanton gang had been brought to justice, their reign of terror ended. But there was also sadness. Ethan's former outlaw companions, who had helped them in Dust Creek, had eventually drifted apart, some finding redemption, others returning to their old ways. Some had met violent ends. The frontier, it seemed, was a relentless force, shaping lives and destinies in its own unpredictable way. Sarah stayed with them for several weeks, sharing stories, catching up on lost time, and forging a new bond with Lillian, the woman who had become her father's partner, his love, his soulmate. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned to Ethan and Lillian, her eyes filled with gratitude.
"Thank you," she said, "for everything,
for giving me back my father, and for giving him a new life." Ethan and Lillian smiled, their hearts filled with love. They had found their happy ending, not in escaping their pasts, but in confronting them, in overcoming adversity, in finding love and redemption in the most unexpected of places. Sarah rode away, disappearing into the vastness of the mountains, leaving Ethan and Lillian alone once more. They stood on their porch, their arms around each other, watching the sunset, their faces bathed in the golden light. They had built a life together, a life of peace, of love, of quiet contentment. They had found their sanctuary, their haven, their home. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they knew that their journey, their long and arduous journey, had finally come to an end. They were home, at last, together, forever. The vast horizon, once a symbol of uncertainty, now represented the boundless possibilities of their future, a future built on love, trust, and the enduring strength of their hearts. The echoes of the past still lingered, but they were muted, softened by the passage of time and the profound peace they had found in each other's arms. They had faced the storm, and they had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than ever before. Their life was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the enduring beauty of a love forged in the heart of the wild, untamed West. The end.